I flew here from New York City. And to get here, I calculate that I had to show some form of identification 25 times. To board an airplane, to enter Morocco, to check into my hotel, and so on. Fortunately for me, when I was born in California, about 30 years ago, my parents registered my birth in the vital record system of Alameda County. And as a result, I have a birth certificate, a passport, a driver's license, a bank account, credit cards, and a health insurance card. And each one of those documents was useful in some way to get me into this room today. Each one of these documents demonstrates that I am who I say I am. You all probably have a similar portfolio of documents. But imagine that those documents were stolen, lost, destroyed, or disowned by the issuing authority. Or imagine that the issuing authority, a country, a state, a government agency, itself disappeared. And what if you'd never had a birth certificate, a passport, a national ID card, a driver's license? Nothing to prove that you are you. What would you do? For more than 1 billion people, this is their situation every day. Let me repeat that. 1 billion of our fellow global citizens are unable to prove their identity because they lack any recognized ID. That's 1/7 of the world's population. That means that 1 in 7 people have no way of proving who they are outside of their local communities. In effect, they are invisible. Now, the ability to prove who you are with certainty and in a manner that's recognized and trusted by institutions and by governments is a fundamental prerequisite to accessing even the most basic services. If you can't prove who you are, you have limited access to healthcare, to education, to other social programs. Your ability to move across borders, to vote, to enroll in school, to access a bank account is limited or non-existent. What's more, women and children are at a greater risk of being victims of human trafficking. So whatever is your most urgent concern, refugees, economic inequality, human trafficking, financial inclusion, universal health care, global education, I could go on. Whatever it is, you care about identity. Indeed, the UN estimates that 10 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals cannot be met without first closing the identity gap. Even more fundamentally, identity is a human right. Article 6 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights reads, "Everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law." Let me stress that. Everyone, everywhere. There is dignity, there is opportunity in being able to prove your identity. This, I'm told, is the word crisis in Chinese. I've also been told that the characters individually represent danger and opportunity. In the spirit of full disclosure, I don't speak nor write Chinese, and there is some controversy as to whether this is in fact a correct translation. Nonetheless, I think the maxim itself is useful. A crisis is both a danger and an opportunity. The fact that 1 billion people are today denied this fundamental human right of having a recognized identity is indeed a crisis. And there is increasing urgency at many levels to address this crisis quickly and by harnessing the power of information technology to address it digitally. Today, more than half the planet has access to the internet. Still more have access to mobile devices. So more and more our relationships with institutions and with each other take place in digital spaces. So while digital ID is, at its core, exactly what it sounds like, using digital technology to prove that you are you, if you interact with technology, any technology connected to the internet, you have a digital identity. So the question isn't if digital identity will happen. It's already happening. The real question is how. And as I will share with you, there is both danger and opportunity in how that crisis is addressed. Let's start with the opportunity, because the opportunity is huge. The benefits to refugees, the homeless, the marginalized, and the structurally poor are perhaps the most pressing, but well-conceived digital ID would benefit everyone. According to a recent McKinsey study, 3.2 billion people globally are already active participants in the digital world, but are facing growing complexity and security challenges that could be addressed through digital ID. Another 3.4 billion people have some form of physical ID, but limited access to digital services. Moving to a digital ID would enable them to take advantage of the efficiency and inclusion benefits that digital services offer. Finally, there are the billion people globally who lack any form of ID and for whom this need is most urgent. Here in Morocco, while 42% of Morocco's 36 million citizens are active participants in the digital world, there we go. An estimated 30%, or almost 10 million people, have only some form of ID, of paper-based ID, but limited access to those digital services, while another 10 million have no form of legal ID whatsoever. This is certainly a crisis, but the flip side is that digital ID could directly improve the lives of 20 million Moroccans. So the benefits of providing a secure, reliable form of digital identity should speak for themselves. But in case I haven't yet made that point, a few more statistics. Digital ID could, according to the same McKinsey study, make financial services available to an additional 1.7 billion people. Digital identity could also save 110 billion hours of people's time spent standing in line through the use of e-government services. 110 billion hours. Digital identity could also increase workforce participation through skill matching, reduce government fraud, and potentially create economic value equivalent to 6% of GDP in emerging economies and 3% in developed economies. So yes, there's a crisis, but what an opportunity. Here's the rub. With opportunity comes danger. Digital identity systems have to be thoughtfully designed and carefully implemented. If not, they can be more dangerous than no identity at all. And there are two distinct and equally important risks that I want to flag today. First, there's the risk of misuse. There is also the risk of misuse. At the most basic, there's the risk of exclusion as these systems become more and more embedded in our daily lives. If somebody doesn't have a way of proving who they are, as more and more services require that proof of identity, there's a greater and greater risk that they're cut off from the services that they need. Leaving people behind, that's an instance of misuse. And we already have examples of just how dangerous this can be. For example, the Aadhaar program is now estimated to cover 88% of India's 1.3 billion citizens. As Aadhaar was rolled out, there were reports of people starving because they were unable to get the food subsidies they had previously claimed. What happened? Proof of identity was made a requirement for this food program. So people who didn't register or couldn't register for the ID system were suddenly unable to claim their food benefits. And they starved. That's a tragedy. It's a tragedy of misuse. And in addition to misuse, there's of course the very real risk of misuse of digital identification data. The most egregious risks range from discrimination and denial of due process rights to the facilitation of ethnic cleansing and genocide. It must never be forgotten that any time personal information is collected, there's a risk of misuse and of abuse. It is facilitating the marginalization of China's ethnic minorities today, and it's been happening since the dawn of digital technologies, greatly accelerating the implementation of the Nazis' final solution starting 80 years ago. Even programs launched with the best of intentions face serious risk of misuse. The New York City ID program was launched in 2015, and the idea was to create a program that was easy to enroll in and was residency-based rather than citizenship-based. All 1 million immigrants in New York City, both documented and undocumented, were encouraged to enroll. The city of New York was seeking to avoid a misuse scenario, providing access to anyone, regardless of status, an official form of identification necessary to function effectively in the city. The program has been very successful at improving lives. It's enabled many to open their first bank account, to sign their first lease, to access city services for the first time. But in trying to avoid a misuse situation, they unintentionally created a risk, potentially a huge risk, of misuse. Immigrants who enrolled provided copies of their foreign-issued birth certificate, passport, or other official documentation. So on a server in an undisclosed location in New York City, the city's administration had digital copies of nearly 400,000 foreign passports, as many driver's licenses, and thousands of birth certificates, visas, military photo ID cards, consular documents, work permits, etc. Many civil rights advocates became very, very concerned about a potential misuse of that data by the US federal government following the 2016 election, when the Trump administration adopted a harshly restrictive immigration stance. It was feared that access to these records would be used to facilitate arrests and deportation. Luckily, the data was scrubbed. But giving people the keys to your personal information is something you can't revoke easily once it's been done, which means that you cannot just think about whether you trust the current administration with your data. You need to consider whether you'll be able to trust whomever comes into power in the future with your data. And it's not just the risk of misuse by governments we need to consider. We also need to consider the risk of misuse by companies or even by NGOs. And this goes for all of us here too. Every single one of us who's on the digital grid. Everyone who is under the impression that they've got their digital identity covered and under control. You don't. If you've stayed in one of the hotels of the Marriott group, are a Yahoo or Facebook user, your digital identity and your personal data may be among the over 4 billion accounts that have already been compromised by just these 3 companies. So your digital identity, no matter where you're from, is decidedly not under your control, not sufficiently secure, and of significant enough value to someone who would like to exploit it for their own illegal, illicit, or at a minimum unauthorized purposes. So not only is there a need for a digital identity, there's a need for good digital identity. Good digital identity is personal. It's unique to you and only to you. Good digital identity is persistent. It lives with you from birth until death. Good digital identity is private. You control your own identity, and you selectively choose what to share and with whom. Privacy and security is a necessity, not a nice to have. And finally, good digital identity is portable. It follows and is accessible to you wherever you may need to be, including across institutional and geographic borders. Now, I don't want you to think of this as a purely technical problem. Technology will mitigate some of the risks we've discussed. For example, cryptographically secure, decentralized systems can provide greater privacy protection for users, while also allowing for portability and verifiability. But this better model of digital identity will not emerge spontaneously from the technology. Quite the contrary. Instead, widespread agreement on principles, technical design, and interoperability standards is needed for decentralized digital identities to be effective, recognized, and trusted. And this requires sustained, transparent public-private partnership to set the future course of digital ID and to navigate its risks. This is a human challenge, not a technical challenge, and it requires human cooperation and collaboration. So as I conclude my comments, here are the 3 things I want you to remember, the 3 critical things to hear. First, the development of digital ID is happening now, and we need to get it right. This is important, and it's urgent. Second, we're at a fork in the road when it comes to digital ID, and policymakers and technologists need to take the risks of digital identity misuse and misuse seriously. We need to actively, intentionally, and loudly choose the path of privacy. And finally, this challenge is enormous, and it won't be solved by any single organization, whether that's a government, a company, an NGO, working alone. We must work collaboratively. Thank you.